So beginning with the end in mind, this is a quick overview of the modules, but I'll just focus on the first two today. For module one, we're going to talk about the SDOH equity and different types of visualizations that we'll use throughout these modules. And then module two, it guides you to plan your project, facilitate who your stakeholders will be, and then define and refine the goals.
As you already know, the Healthy Regions and Policies Lab is currently located at the U of I. And as a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. So the U of I sits on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscatine, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts.
The first thing I believe is to start from a base. We read your papers, we read your proposals, and we know that you have understanding of what you want, what solution you need, and what are the outcomes. But in order to start, we need to put everything on the table. And the first thing that I want to tell you, and I know that perhaps it's weird when we're talking about data visualizations, when we're talking about digital applications. But what I really want to consider is to have a journal. In my own experiences as a map maker, having something with me all the time really helped me in my process. And once the process is that, mapping is more than the final outcome. Mapping is thinking, is talking with the stakeholders, is working with your colleagues as you already start doing that, sharing experiences, sharing your expertise, also sketching. Don't be shy to just start drawing, erasing, put everything on the table. And also, you need to be aware of that you will be gaining experience from other data visualizations, but not only about SDOH or health, other ones, in terms of design, in terms of imagination. So my first advice for you, and you will start noting how it will impact your work from these models and further, is to have always with you and often with you a journal. The other thing that for me, it's really interesting is to have a base of what we understand or what we think about SDOH. Once again, you already wrote about that and you wrote it greatly. But we're going to tell you what SDOH is for us, for me, and how we work with that. SDOH is complex. It's multi-layer and multi-scale. It could go from the individual to the community to the regional. But in this toolkit, we'll focus mostly in the regional and the community. Why? Because that understanding can produce a better way to analyze, to gather data, and understand how different communities, how different groups can interact towards interacting with the communities and their places. How? Because SDOH compounds different aspects of health, from the community stability, from education, from health, from neighborhood built environment, and from social community and context. But what I want to tell you is that all these aspects that I just mentioned, it's not just about the location. It's about how places interact with the communities, how places bring to them sense of belonging, of ownership, access to certain assets, such as green spaces or schools. All these interactions will tell you stories. It's not about just numbers, it's about the story of each community. So when you think about here, at least, about SDOH, please think about the community, the neighborhood, the region in a most broader scale. A good exercise of how this can be studied, it's, for example, from our own Marinia Kolak and Norma Padron, who's stakeholder in this fellowship. They, in a study, measured how a neighborhood view of SDOH at the multidimensional level can predict over 60% of premature deaths. So it could tell you a lot and give you a lot. Think about those scales. The best way to think about all these scales as well is perhaps going to the most recent and unfamous pandemic in the last years, the COVID pandemic. How we can think about what happened in Mississippi and the relationships, but also what is different of what happened in Illinois and what happened in Texas, how it affects the Latinx community or the Black community in different places. So going back and forth in the community, the location, it can help us better understand how SDOH interacts with different locations and places. So my first question for you, and this question, please, if you have your journal right now, try to write it and try to answer it now and during the whole module. Please consider how place and SDOH is important for a project. What's the role of place? What's the role of SDOH? And how they link it together. If you can start answering that questions, you will start thinking of your visualization, but also the outcomes of this process.
What does centering equity actually look like? Just so you know that centering equity is not just something that you might think is important, but oftentimes it's absolutely necessary to consider. You can go to the next slide. Just one. Okay. So you want to think about centering equity in these few points, and a longer description is actually on our module. So I'll just quickly go through them. So for setting the parameters of equity, it's obviously about your decision making, being inclusive, your target population. When you focus on equity, you want to focus on the different needs of your community. You want to think about and address the historical considerations. And for the subject of equity, think about inclusivity again, and then also those historical considerations and how they actually impact the present day. And then the content of equity, procedural, distributive, and contextual equity. And so next, I'll just go through an example of what that might look like for you. So equity, orientation, and practice. So let's pretend that I am making a thematic map and I want to improve access to healthcare services for low-income families in an urban neighborhood, right? So if I'm looking at the setting parameters of equity, I want to focus on including different stakeholders. And you think about that as like, obviously with the residents, right? Community leaders. You can also think about people like church, etc. And for my target population, I know I want to focus on low-income families in a specific urban neighborhood. It could be obviously like, Baltimore is one that really comes to mind since I spent a lot of time there. So when you focus on equity, make sure you're focusing on the different needs, right? Don't just assume that you know what they need. Actually, maybe do a needs assessment and actually, focus on those needs specifically. So for example, this community might need more language interpreter services, or like they might have issues with transportation, etc. And then addressing those historical considerations. So that means, thinking about the historical injustices or systemic inequities that contribute to their current day experiences. And that could be redlining, disinvestment, and then, or a lack of access to quality healthcare facilities over time. And then for the final 2 points, for a subject of equity, again, inclusivity. So making sure that your visualization is culturally competent and linguistically appropriate. So for example, you might need bilingual languages. For example, you don't want everything in English. You might need some, depending on your community, you might need some things in French, Spanish, Creole, things like that. And your graphics, just considering the colorblind guidelines, there's like websites that you can go to online that will tailor your website or find different colors that adhere to these specific colorblind guidelines to help you pick the right colors for your project. And then also consider alternative platforms, like maybe you have audio descriptions enabled or something like that. And for the generalizations and historical considerations, thinking about the intergenerational effects that can play out in present day. So for your visualization, you might want to include like the historical trends over time and just illustrating how those disparities have changed, or maybe they stay the same. And then the content of equity. So that's procedural, distributive, and contextual. Procedural, you want people involved in your design process. You want them to be able to tell you, or give you feedback on how easy or hard it is to use. And for that, you can use focus groups or surveys, community forums, and things like that. For distributive equity, make sure you're allocating resources to basically just based on the community need. That might look different for each of you. And then lastly, for the contextual equity, so just keeping things in context, considering the social determinants of health. So you might want to consider poverty, housing instability, or food insecurity. Like for this project, I would have layers on my map showing the correlations between healthcare access and social factors that would guide policymakers and stakeholders in their decision-making process. And yeah, so that's a quick overview of what I would do if I, was in your shoes and how I would consider equity in my project. And so just some things to consider. You want to understand the impact of trauma, right? Especially for your specific group. You want to prioritize safety and trust. You want to promote choice and empowerment, avoid re-traumatization, be cultural sensitive and diverse. You want to engage your stakeholders and communities, have a continuous feedback loop. So you always are changing or making additions to your project. And then obviously you want to be ethical with your data using privacy. People trust you, so you might want to, just be careful with the information that you put out about them.
So we already have a lot in this really broad introduction. And we talk about a bit of SDOH, Camila talk about equity and trauma, and how they are related to place. However, the trick about, or one of the most important parts of this fellowship is to really focus on the type of application that we want to use, pick and mobilize. And one of the main worries and the main problems sometimes is that we want to tell a lot, almost everything with one application. And here, that's not what we want. What I want is to think about maps as both a mean to tell a story and an actor. As a mean is what I'm trying to say with my map, who I am, or when I'm looking at somebody else, maybe a colleague, who's him, what's his background, what he's trying to say, what's he representing, what features are emphasized, and in terms of equity and trauma, which ones are removed, what are not telling, what the map is not telling us with us. That's why, even though that most of you already have understanding which type of application want to use, we in this toolkit want to, in a way, review and show you the other ones. And those, the one that we picked are 4. Please, Mark. This is just a review we want to focus that with Catherine in module 6. But there are 4 of them: asset maps, simple thematic maps, story maps, and multi-rate dashboards. Those will allow us to tell different things about SDOH and places. And some of them have their own strengths and their own constraints. So I want to make a review quickly of these 4, so you can start thinking about what you want and what are these pros and cons of this application. In the toolkit and the document, you will find this diagram elaborated by Marinia and Kamaria. And I believe this could be a really nice way to start navigating about what you want. You have 4 pillars, 4 different points, and you have intersections there. Sometimes and oftentimes you will find that your project perhaps is in the boundaries of one of those. And perhaps you will try to sketch something on your journal to see how it will look like. Perhaps you want to see something on the web that can say like, okay, maybe that's what I want. But please, when you are in doubt, go to the diagram and try to see, I want something that is complex, more a reference map. I want something that is more complex, that can allow us, the users to navigate. That depends, but it's not something that you need to pick right now. Don't try to stick to your guns. If something works more or it's better, go there and try to sketch and try to go. I will now go really fast, but in depth about the 4 different visualizations that we're gonna see and learn in this toolkit. The first one is asset maps. So asset maps are simple but effective. It's more about what it is in a community, in a neighborhood, what I have, what are my opportunities, and what is not. Usually here, the better and the best way to build a map is when we already have the data, when we already know where it's there. And we want to express and mobilize the asset map so people can start thinking about the opportunity and the opportunities that they have or what is lacking. It's more about the why, what is missing. But for me, the key of asset map, maybe on all for visualizations, but this one is the collaboration. We don't know everything about the community, but if we can create a collaboration about what is there, how can we be an asset for the community, I believe that you can start flying with your asset map. So the key question is, where is a resource and what it is? The second one, please, Mark. It's one of the most artistic and design-based visualization, the thematic map. If the asset map is, where is it? The thematic map is how it behaves, how the data can tell us about something in a concrete geographic area. For example, here we can see the national data, but also there are regions. And if we go further and further, we can see counties, neighborhoods. And we start working with spatial analysis, we see trends, and then we can make assumptions and questions about what's happening there. The thematic map enables a better understanding about the different locations and the relationship between them. We can see patterns. And the most important part is that even though that we have what we call a choropleth map, we have different more. We can have a heat map. We can have a points map. We have a point density map. We have different flavors. So in those terms, we can play with them in an artistic way. And the key question for me is like, how does the social determinant of health manifest within the spatial framework? The third one is maybe my favorite because it's what I do for a living. Please, Mark. Is story maps. And here we really embrace wholeheartedly the subjective, emotional, and the storytelling part that maps bring to humanity. And in these terms, to health and SDOH. Maps are not objective, are subjective. and we bring them and mobilize them to tell stories from early in humanity nowadays. What is really important here in this year, 2023, 2024, is that we have different ways of telling stories by using maps. We have multimedia, we have videos, we have text, we have images, we have photos. We can do a lot of things and mix and match all these things to tell a compelling story. So when you use story map, think about that. How can I tell a story? And if it's not a well-known story, even better. How we can embrace emotion, subjectivity, and we call sense of place, philias, phobias, how we as a community or a community embrace those. And my last question, but also advice, also try to understand, sorry, what's the role of place in the narrative that you want to create? Place not as a location, place as an actor. And the last one, Mark, thank you. And I want to talk about the spatial data dashboards, which are huge. And the COVID pandemic, as you may know, really trigger most of this. They are so important because we can mix and match different kind of visualizations. Yes, for example, we have a thematic map there, but also we have a graph. And then on top of that, we can have stories. So they are really complex and are really a way of telling a story as well as really focus on what a really complex subject based on this SDOH is in space. What is the most tricky part of that dashboards? Is make them user-friendly and intuitive. So many times in my experience, we have really impressive data dashboards that people do not use, and they stay in the academic realm and scholar realm. They are amazingly complex, analytical, but they stay there. And I believe that the beauty of the data dashboards is that allow users to interact and in a constructivistic way learn by mobilizing different types of data. So my last question related to spatial data dashboards is, which spatial data is most relevant for exploring and analyzing on a specific SDOH topic? As I said, we cannot tell everything, but we can allow the users to navigate and try to form their own inquiries towards SDOH and place.
Next module. So here we're going to be talking about planning your project. So the goal of this project was to develop some place-based data visualization or application support system that will integrate SDOH and an equity framework. But again, what will you do specifically and why are you doing that? So in this module, you're going to identify your motivations, refine your goals, define stakeholders, assess project strengths and needs, and draft your project requirements. This is the most important phase of a project, and often a lot of people don't do it. And that ends up generating a lot of different challenges throughout the process and down the road. So don't skip these steps and take the time you need to really think through each aspect. A lot of the kind of homework that you'll have between this week and our next module will actually be working on this module. All right, so next slide. So we're going to start off with a series of questions. And this is where feel free to bring in your journals at this stage, like even now, because we start off with questions and just quick impressions that you have, right? So first, where is your application? Is it within a single city? Is it within a neighborhood? Is it across the country? And there's going to be different pros and cons to each of those. So greater spatial coverage does not necessarily mean that your project will get more complex. So for example, maybe you want to focus on a specific neighborhood in a city. It may actually be easier to get data for all the neighborhoods in that city than just extract data for that one neighborhood, depending on the kind of data that you're working with. At the same time, if you change the spatial resolution, that's something slightly different, that does tend to make projects more complicated. So like, if you wanted to explore policies for all 50 states of Medicaid expansion, no problem. 50 states, 50 rows of your data set, no problem. But if you want to grab census tract data for the entire country, that's about 77,000 rows. And that will start to limit your visualization options because some software approaches will be able to handle that easily and others won't. And you're going to have to match, like, for example, you might need to be a lot more comfortable with programming and innovative approaches to handling, medium to large size data. And if you're not, then, the spatial resolution challenge can come up. So first, figure out where is your application. That's really, really important because that will guide some of the data selections later. Okay, next, who is your application about? Is it a specific population defined by where they live and or some social, economic, or other characteristic? And then who is your application for? Who will actually be using your application, and how and why might those two groups be different? So as our toolkit is going to highlight more than once, it's going to be very helpful to work with people who will actually use your application to increase its meaning and utility. At the same time, it's helpful to work with people who the data is about, as lived experiences will provide really helpful insight, depth, and understanding of the project that you're working with. Okay, next up is when is your application? So are you focused on the most recent data that you can find? Or are you interested in data over multiple time periods? And then start to think about how the application will change over time. Are you expecting that it will be changed or updated over time, or is it going to be more of a time capsule of just one point in time? So this is where you're going to think about sustainability, long-term maintenance needs of your project. Where will it be in 5 years? Is it okay for it to exist as a time capsule, or do you prefer to have the data updated regularly? At this point, don't worry about how you're going to do that. That's what we'll cover in later modules. But right now, you need to kind of identify what your goals are, right? Right, next up is what actions should or could result from your application. Are those actions reasonable? Are they feasible? Are they time bound? It's really, really common to start with a very ambitious goal. And part of this process is to kind of refine that over the course of the project's implementation. So try to be realistic and honest when assessing what your final project can do. And then finally, why should people care? This is often a really important question and also the one least formulated in early stages of the process. Something that might be interesting and meaningful to you may not be important to others, or it may be really obvious to you and your peers, but the thought hasn't occurred to a different group, a different discipline, a different domain. So be really specific and intentional in setting that objective and do the research. So putting these together, you're going to start to create like an overview goal statement for your project, include the primary question you're trying to answer. And this is probably going to change a lot throughout the process, but again, should be changed to be refined further. So you're refining, you're not pushing the scope out. So be aware of that. You start big and you whittle it down. You don't want to start growing in the opposite direction because then it becomes less realistic. You can do this in a couple of months. Okay, next slide. So take your project a step further to kind of dig deeper into how your application can address SDOH directly and be really specific. So there's a couple of ideas here. You can read more about them on the toolkit, but I'll highlight just two. So for example, environmental justice. You could create a dashboard to assess environmental health risks and exposures in a specific city or place. You could combine graphs, maps, and tables to identify areas with environmental hazards that will disproportionately affect specific communities, thus contributing to health disparities, right? Very specific goal. Community engagement. So maybe you're going to make a story map, and that would be an opportunity to link community voices into the mapping interface and enable community members to participate in the decision making, voice their concerns, and collaborate to highlight their experiences that address their specific needs and concerns. So we recommend choose just 1 or 2 goals, SDOH goals for your project. And so a little bit earlier, we talked about centering equity in module 1. So Kamaria was taking us through that. Here, we recommend that you really specifically determine what your content of equity will be for your project. And it's probably going to just be one of these. Are you doing procedural equity, distributive equity, or contextual equity? So if you're integrating community stakeholders directly into the decision-making processes of the application, you're integrating procedural equity. That's the content. If you're developing an asset map of local health and social resources to maximize networking and connections, that's a really great example of distributive equity. And then if you're focused on kind of communicating the processes that drive the health disparities, right? Like maybe you're curating a story map that invites users to walk through a neighborhood over time as it becomes segregated from highway construction. That would be an example of contextual equity. So here, we're going to start to examine your team. Are you working on your own? Many of you will be working on your own, you think, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Or maybe some of you are working as part of a group at a large organization. Either way, you're going to need to determine who will take on the different responsibilities in project planning and implementation. So here we have, sample responsibilities and sample description of who might be working with that, right? Consider expanding your team to invite community stakeholders and leaders to help set strategies and priorities. If you're taking on both engineering, implementation, and design, recognize you are only human and that you may have to focus on one more than the other in your initial prototype, right? So try to connect with potential users of the application early on, and also expect the unexpected. Not everyone is going to use the application the way that you expect. So starting to open lines and finding ways of understanding who's using your application will be super helpful to see how that is changing over time. So in some of my medical informatics training, and within that world, there's very complex definitions of all of these. That's also included in the references at there's one good example at the end of the module here. So they introduce additional roles like the champion and the curmudgeon. The champion is going to help you get funding. They might have told you to apply to this project. They're going to write you letters of support and they're going to boost you up. Their curmudgeon is the opposite. They're going to be, or already are, super skeptical about what you're doing, complaining that they prefer doing things their way, probably manually, and they just like the way things have always been done. So our approach here is don't let either approach sway you too much in the planning stages, but just be aware of their role. The champion's there to boost you up, but you don't want to shift the project to please them because they're probably not your user audience. And in the same way, you don't want to respond to the curmudgeon in one way or the other at this stage, just to kind of ensure that you're able to work successfully. All right, so the next one. All right, so here, as you assess your stakeholders, both on your implementation team, so again, it might start off as a team of one, or you might have a larger team, and then you start to consider users of the application, you want to start building and joining a community of practice to support and inspire your work. So social media groups are classic entryways to multiple communities of practice. Those of you who decide to either learn R or expand R later on in the modules, there's a huge community of support out there for that. That's why we chose that as one of the programming languages. If you choose the open source options like QGIS and Geoda, similarly, there's a big community out there that are eager to nerd out about it. So also we link here, maybe one of the staff can link the mentor map link. This is a really great tool, not just for academics, but for everyone to get really specific about your community and your life at your time. And so, for example, my cat is on my mentor map because she provides emotional support when I need breaks between projects, right? There's also going to be folks who will link you to access to opportunities. There may be folks who would be kind of readers or, intellectual or building your intellectual community and that sort of thing. So this map will seem intimidating at first, but it's going to get filled pretty quickly. And also recognize that your fellowship community is part of your community of practice. So we just launched the LinkedIn SDOH in Place community group. It is right now private, and that's so that you guys can start to share ideas and progress and that sort of thing. And later we'll also open up a GitHub community so that you can start to for those of you who are ready to do that, share in that space as well. All right, so let's continue to assess. You're identifying your community, building, up the support around you, and now you have to really focus in on your own specific strengths. So are your strengths in domain expertise? Maybe you have a really deep knowledge of the topic you're interested in. You might be the person who's managing a resource list for a community group as the go-to person. Potentially you've spent years reading and researching some niche of the world. Perhaps you're part of the community your app is for and have extensive lived experiences that are invaluable to the topic. On the technical side, maybe you're used to learning new programming and software skills on the regular for your organization or in your schooling. Perhaps you're already familiar with data wrangling from studies or practice, or potentially you're not a coder yet, but have extensive organizational skills and impressive file management systems and like to order tasks by logic and level of importance, right? No one person will have all of these things, and you shouldn't expect to. So at this stage, you want to identify what you're good at and maybe even enjoy a little bit. And that will be really helpful to kind of, again, build out your project planning at this stage. So you've got your strengths. From there, you're going to start to assess your needs. What are the project needs? And we kind of section this off into data resources, community resources, computing resources, and then attitude resources. So data resources. What do you have and what do you need? Are you starting off with a list of resources you want to put on an asset map? Or are you going to have to, maybe you want to work on a data dashboard and you're going to have to find a lot of community level data to assess that. And also, what's your data strategy? We link a data maturity assessment survey from data.org in the link in the toolkit as well. Because it turns out that this is its own really complex decision to kind of assess where you are, what your needs are, and that will potentially be really helpful to you. So community resources are just as important. Who's in your community and what skills do they have that they can connect you with? Maybe you're really, maybe you're in a situation where you are surrounded by a bunch of folks who are, eager to help. Maybe they're really, really busy though, so you're going to have to identify, just chunks of questions at a time. Then also, who will take over the project in the future? So again, this is going to link to that sustainability of that project. Computing resources. Are you at a university or institution that has, massive amounts of software available to you? They've paid the licenses and they're planning to pay that for the long term. Or are you working in a situation where sustainability means working with free and open source technologies and training so that it can be used effectively in your group over time without great cost? And then finally, what's your attitude about this? What do you love to do and what do you hate to do? I love figuring out like what data to use on a project. It makes me really happy. It's like a big puzzle. But many of my colleagues absolutely hate that part. So I'm a resource to them. But on the flip side, are you a prototyper or are you an optimizer? Are you eager to get into a project and get something, stood up that is maybe jerry-rigged a little bit and like, kind of working, but looks okay? Or are you an optimizer where everything has to be done exceptionally well? I'm definitely a prototyper, and that's why I love to work with optimizers and vice versa, because together we make a great team. So just knowing like there's nothing bad or good about any of these things, you just have to figure out where you are. So I know some of you will groan at this slide, but project management approaches can be very helpful. So in a second, we're going to go into breakout rooms and you're going to create a goal, and it's going to be a SMART goal. All of you are here because we thought that your projects were smart. We actually use this criteria when kind of determining who would make it to the last stage. So you want to be specific about your goals. So again, we talked about the SDOH goals earlier in your project objectives. You want your goals to be measurable, right? How are you going to determine whether or not you're hitting your, your final benchmarks at the end of this? Maybe you want to have website views marked as a measure of success. Maybe it's going to be marked as a successful workshop where you've disseminated your application to your audience. You want to make sure your project's achievable, that it can be done within 3 months. You want to make sure that the goal is relevant, and time bound as well. All right, so we're not going to have time to go into the details here, but part of your homework will be reading, again, this module in detail and going through different system requirements, user requirements based on your goals and how they're getting refined at this stage. A lot of those requirements will be in direct response to your specific strengths, your specific project needs, and that sort of thing, right? So this is where you're going to kind of finalize your approach as it is now. Again, it may change, but you're going to start to finalize this and also think about potential user behaviors that will come on your application. On the right-hand side, I have a whole selection of different potential behaviors. These are actually called affordances in design language. So there's a bit more on that in the toolkit, but it goes from level with increasing complexity. So some of you might want to start with real-time visualizations, dynamic updates, temporal sliders. I'm here to tell you, start simple. unless you already have a prototype that has the basics. You don't ever want to start with the most complex thing. You want to start simple and grow. That will be the most sustainable option. So maybe you want to select a variable from a dropdown. Maybe you want to click on a resource for a pop-up window and that sort of thing. At this stage too, you're going to also start to think about refining your plan and management approach. So we really recommend agile processes that are constantly adapting as you inspect the outcomes. That's different from the waterfall method where you start with an idea, you make a plan, you do it, you're done. That doesn't really work in this world. You really need to be flexible and be prepared to adapt regularly. And so we also have some tips on developing timelines, breaking down tasks. And even if it's really simple, even if it's just a couple of sentences or some sketches, anticipate that you need to document what you're doing as you're doing it. That will help ensure that it remains reproducible and you're committed to, open processes, open science, that sort of thing. And you also want to think about your communications plan. This will, we'll delve into this for stakeholders towards the end of the series. But for now, how are you going to communicate with with your team, with potential stakeholders while the project is happening?